So the other thing you can do is try to find out what the pay range is prior to going in for an interview. And one of the ways that you can handle that is when someone calls to set up the interview, is to ask what the pay range is on the position. And in many cases, they're not going to want to give that to you, so you can say, then what is the hiring range on this job? I really don't want to take up your time if it's a pay range that I'm not willing to accept. And you know, usually somebody's caught so off guard by that they'll give you, well, a minimum start pay would be. And so then from there you can go, okay, I've already got 5 years experience in this field. They're not going to hire me at the minimum. I'm probably going to be okay with whatever they offer. So sometimes.
Has anybody ever asked you for a salary history before?
Mm-hmm.
We'll run into that, yeah. And that's an HR trick to kind of make sure that we're in the same ballpark.
And the other thing I use when they ask for a salary history, especially when you are supposed to send in a resume, is I have a paragraph at the end of my cover letter. And this actually got me a job because they read my resume, decided that I would have outpriced their company. When they didn't find a candidate they liked, they went back and they read my cover letter again because they remembered it. And what I talked about in the last paragraph of the cover letter was, not only is my salary negotiable, but the things that I am looking for and considering in accepting a position are. And I discuss things like flexibility, benefits, culture of the company, and I have quite a string of them. And they were so impressed with that they decided to call me and ask me if I would consider their salary range. And it got me a very good job. It turned out they were going to hire a director of HR. After they hired me, when they sent the letter out to the employees announcing this new HR department being created, I called up the president and said, I think you made a mistake in this letter. You hired a director of HR and your secretary said vice president of HR. And he said, I reconsidered. You need to be a vice president because of the things you're going to be doing in this company and what you are bringing to us.
That's neat. She got a promotion before she got.
Yeah, really.
So what you need to do is refine your cover letters and try to think ahead and not back yourself into a pay corner, because you might even find the job that you know is a stepping stone to that career that you want, and it's going to pay you $10,000 less than what you think you're worth. But if you say you want that extra $10,000, are you going to get an offer?
Nope.
No. But if you stay flexible, are you going to get the offer?
Mm-hmm.
Real good chance you will. And maybe you can even talk them up a couple of thousand.
Mm-hmm. And just the last thing I think around the pay structure. Okay, so we've looked at the ranges. We've talked about how you build ranges, how you build the pay structure. If you have any questions about that, please don't hesitate to ask. But I'm going to say, okay, we've built your pay structure now. You've got it in place. But how do you keep it current? Because if you look at the survey data is as of a point in time. It is always getting out of date. Every day it's getting out of date. So you can't just build your pay structure and just let it sit there, because, you know, as we said, what you're trying to do is, you know, motivate and retain your employees, attract, motivate, and retain. If your salary structure is just sitting there going farther and farther and farther behind being competitive over time because you're not updating it, then you're not going to be offering competitive salaries anymore. You're not going to be able to attract people. You'll have difficulty retaining. So you can't just do this as a one-time thing and let it sit there. It's something that you have to manage on an ongoing basis to keep this pay structure current. The biggest job is clearly building it. Keeping it current isn't normally a big deal, and usually what I would say, not in this economic environment, but normally I would say that you just generally need to, on an annual basis, look at what other companies are doing and raise your salary scales in line with what the competitive marketplace is doing. I had one client who had 46 employees and had 27 grades. That was, I mean, they were administering all these grades, and most of them obviously were empty because they had at least 12 of those people in the bottom 2 grades. They were van drivers. And so it didn't leave a whole lot for the remaining, 20-some grades that 25 grades that they had. And they didn't really do promotions. The jobs, the skill sets didn't translate well, so it was like, why are you administering all these grades? So, that was the extreme of not having enough people in your grades, obviously, and we consolidated that down. But, I mean, generally you're going to have multiple jobs in your grades, and you would have the number of grades that kind of works for your organization. It sort of depends. You've got a spread between whatever the lowest level jobs are paid in your organization competitively to whatever the highest level jobs in your organization are paid competitively. And somehow you've got to distribute your grade structure, all your different grades between that high and that low. And it'll depend somewhat on, your particular organization. Like you said, you can go with, 10% distance between midpoints or 20%. And obviously if you go 20%, you're going to have half as many grades in that same high and low range as if you use 10%. So the number of grades is not a fixed thing. Although you want to be reasonable relative to the number of jobs that you have. So yeah, the grades can vary. Everybody's grade structure looks a little bit different. And kind of to go back to what Nikki had said earlier when we were talking about broadbanding and how you'd have the technical folks that want to stay technical. Some organizations will sort of create side-by-side. If they don't want to do the broadbanding, they'll create some side-by-side pay grade structures where they'll have a structure for the techies and a structure for the managers and that kind of thing. And I typically will set aside like a senior management grade structure that might have different grades, like 1 to 4, or 21 to 24, and everybody else is sort of in like 1 to 18. So it just depends on the organization how you want to build it, and it really depends on the mix of jobs that you have and what's competitive pay for them as to how many jobs you have in each of your grades. In terms of as I said, keeping the pay grade structure current, typically, we would just go, increase it. It's called a range structure adjustment. It's something that you would do typically on an annual basis. You'll look at what are other companies doing in the marketplace, and maybe they're all adjusting their pay structures up 2.5%. Go in and put yours up 2.5%. What that means is you'll add 2.5% to every one of your midpoints. And of course, that'll then recalculate all your minimums and maximums, also to go up 2.5%. So whatever number you plug in there, you just want to make sure you're doing it in line with what other companies are doing, and that'll help you keep, your grade structure current for a number of years. If you keep at it, it's a good idea on an annual basis to at least get some survey data on some of your benchmark jobs, just to make sure that you're still tracking along well. Competitively with those. That just kind of helps you make sure you're doing good. In the past, I would typically say that you could probably go for like 5 years before you'd maybe want to really do a complete review again of all of your salaries against survey data. It's hard to say that right now in this economic situation. If this was year number 5 and you'd been planning to do your complete review this year, I'd say don't bother. Let's just wait and see what happens first, because this would not be a good year to base things on. You know, if you just changed last year, who knows? I'm basically with my clients right now, the pay increase, the range structure adjustments and the pay increase budgets have been dropping by the month in terms of what companies are forecasting. So for my clients right now, I am telling them to freeze their pay structures at whatever it was for 2008. I'm not recommending any increases. Because I just think you need to wait and see what happens. The way things are dropping right now, in the end, 09 may look like 08. I don't think it's going to be actually lower, but I don't think it's going up by a whole lot. So I wouldn't make any changes, and that's what I'm telling my clients at this point as far as this year is concerned. So that would not be something I would ever have said in any prior year in my entire lifetime, basically, because it's always been up. So this is really, as I said, unprecedented in what we're having to do now.
When you say that you're not recommending any changes to your clients, you mean like giving their employees any kind of break?
No, actually in terms of just the range structure adjustment, so like keeping your midpoints current with the competitive marketplace. What it means is, so in 2008, your midpoint for that, whoever's in this grade, their midpoint was 100,000. What I'm saying is that for 2009, I'd leave that midpoint at 200,000. They can still get a pay increase, and actually from the company's standpoint, not increasing your pay ranges is a good thing. Because, you know, eventually these people are going to max out faster if you don't raise your pay ranges. Sounds horrible, but it's economically not, makes sense. So their midpoint will stay the same. So, for example, if you have a person who is currently at, we'll go back to the compa ratio thing, they're at 97%. They're making 97,000, their midpoint's 100,000. If they get a 3% pay increase this year, they'd be lucky this year to get 3%, but let's say they do. 3% on top of 97,000, I hope that's somewhere near 100,000. Anyway, they would get to their midpoint. They'd probably feel pretty good about that, you know, if you share that information. So people can still get their pay increases. What it just means is they'll move up the range faster because the range hasn't gone. We used to have a situation for a number of years in my company where every year the range structure adjustment was 3% because, you know, it's sort of like around inflation or whatever. So every year the midpoints went up 3%. Every year our pay increase budget was 3%. And we did use compa ratio, so everybody'd be sitting there going, I've been at 97% compa ratio for the last 5 years. I am fully competent in this job after 5 years. How come I'm not at 100%? Where are we going to find the money? You know, they're getting the budgeted pay increase every year, but the range kept going up, and so they never caught up. That's why I say it would probably be a good thing to freeze some ranges, because people would finally move to their midpoints, you know, and they'd be happy about that. So, you know, what I've seen in the last few years, and it had nothing to do with what's going on with the economy now, is that companies, I think, have started to kind of get smart, and they've realized that doing the range structure 3% and the budget, pay increase budget 3%, was causing this problem where nobody got closer to their midpoint. So they've started shaving off the range structure adjustment, and they might leave the pay increase budget at 3%, but they'd only increase the structure by 2.5%. So everybody was finally starting to inch up toward their midpoints. And so people felt good about that. So I think companies have started to do that even before this economic situation. And so, like I said, I'm just telling them not to increase the ranges for 2009, because I don't want them to, you know, if they went and increased it 3% and everybody else does nothing, then they're living with being overly competitive technically on their midpoints, and so I don't want them to be there. Yes, thank you. All right, moving on. We did that one already. Just wanted to then sort of in a summary kind of the elements overall of a sound compensation program that you need to have in place We've talked about the first 4 of them already, and we won't go into any of these remainder in detail, but want to make sure you realize it's all part of the program. So certainly you need some performance appraisals, you need your pay increase guidelines, and also bonus and incentive programs, which is like a whole subject in itself. We talked about this one earlier. It's around who's, people who are developing are between minimum and midpoint, so we've really talked about that one already. The philosophy generally used now is called pay for performance, and that's tied into the pay ranges. What pay for performance means in a nutshell is what these bullet points here state, and that is that, typically what you'll look at, and you'll have a pay increase matrix that says, okay, the high performers down by the minimum of their pay range get the biggest percentage pay increases because you want to move them toward the midpoint because you're trying to retain your good performers. So you got to pay them competitively. So you give the biggest percentage pay increases to the folks who are high performers at the low end of their pay range. Because your pay increase budget is limited, and that's the second bullet point, high performers who are up near the maximum, they may get less than the budgeted percent pay increase because you don't want to max them out, and you need that money to give to the people at the bottom end who are high performers. People who are at the high end of the pay range are being paid more than competitively. They don't have a lot of options of places to go. It's not that you don't, appreciate what they do, but they don't have a lot of options. You got to work on taking care of the people at the low end, below that midpoint. Make sure that you keep those good people by making sure they get moved toward the midpoint. And so that's what bullet 2 is about. And that average performers, which should be most employees, progress more slowly through the pay range than the high performers. As I said, incentives and bonuses, otherwise known as variable pay, that's a whole subject in and of itself. But obviously, as we talked about in compensation philosophy, it's part of your overall compensation philosophy and how you pay people. It's a piece of it. These are the things you must have in your incentive plan. Again, it needs to be affordable, motivational. You have to align it with your company goals. It needs to be understandable to your employees, to your managers. I've been in ones that were not understandable, and if they're not understandable to your employees, they're not motivational. So that's real key. You got to communicate it, otherwise it's obviously not going to be motivational to your employees. And lastly, you really need to enable each employee to have what we call a line of sight as to how what they do in their job can impact the company's achievement of its goals. Because unless they can see where what they do matters to how that incentive plan pays out, then it's not motivational. It'll be like, yeah, I get it or I don't get it. I don't know. It's out of my control. So you want to make sure they know that what they do really matters to whether that incentive plan pays out. And that's where you get the motivation from. And this is just a summary overall kind of everything we talked about. You need to know your pay philosophy, whether you're going to target to be a high, low, whatever payer. Build your pay structure, and we've talked about how to go about doing that. You've got to put your employees in the structure. Manage your pay increases, and also your internal equity you need to be aware of going forward. Sometimes you may need to update your pay philosophy and your pay structure as needed. If your business direction kind of changes, you may need to look at that. And certainly to incorporate any variable pay plans and bonus plans as appropriate. Obviously the advantage with the variable pay plans is you can reward employees for good performance without building that fixed cost of base salary. So that's why variable pay has become so much more key, because you don't want to build base salaries or a fixed cost. You can't change them. Variable pay, you can motivate people and pay those high performers and not build your fixed cost. So it's important to keep that in mind. And that is it for that.